Hello and welcome to this edition of the Beacon Hill Report. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and in studio today, her turn in the rotation, as I like to say, State Representative Paul Schmid is joining us. It is, we've passed the Memorial Day weekend, so now the June is upon us, so it's a busy time for you at home, at your real job.
A lot going on the farm these days.
Lots going on the farm.
We calved during the month of April, so that's done. Great calf crop. And we're just about to start harvesting, taking in our hay.
There you go.
So yeah, you're right.
Busy time for you, exactly.
And it's busy up in the State House also.
I noticed obviously the first thing is the Senate recently passed its version of the budget, $56 billion, and now the conference committee gets together and tries to hash this thing out before the fiscal year ends on July 1st. Yep. You got a month to go. I know traditionally it's not something that usually gets done by July 1st, but what is as you look at it, I know you're not in the conference committee, but what's your assessment right now as you're looking at the two versions and what needs to be worked out?
Well, I'm just digesting all the details on the Senate budget, as everybody is. But from 30,000 feet, I'm awful glad that the Senate put in $30 million for the CPA fund. That was something that I tried to do in the House fund.
And what
House
is that,
budget.
for folks that don't know, what is that?
And the CPA is the Community Preservation
Correct,
Act.
yep.
And if a community elects to adopt it, a small percentage is added to your property tax bill, I think maybe 1%. And the state matches that. And those funds can be used for housing, historic preservation, open spaces. A lot of good stuff that would not ordinarily find a way into the budget. Mm-hmm. As we all know, municipal budgets are tight.
And New Bedford has the CPA right now that I know they use.
New Bedford have voted for a CPA maybe
7 years ago, I believe.
7 years ago. Yep. And people tell me they've been able to do wonderful things with it.
I know the council, though, there's some in the city council who say that the tax bills are too high, and they just tried to get the mayor overrode a veto from the council to eliminate the CPA, which they weren't successful in. But I know obviously there are some people who dissent of the CPA. They feel it puts more money on the tax bill.
It does. It's another 1%. So for the average taxpayer, it's another maybe $40 a year, which is another $40, but multiplied by 20,000 tax bills, that's a lot of money.
Well, I know, like I said, I know the council would argue, there are those in the council who would argue with you and say it's more than $40. It's a lot of money, they say, and when you're pinching pennies, like you just said, $40 is $40. Yeah. But there are those, obviously, it didn't pass because there are enough in the council who said it's worth its value, the CPA.
Yeah, and I get it. In Westport, where I come from, we actually had a ballot question. We adopted the Community Preservation Act about 15 years ago, and we had a ballot question about 8 years ago to eliminate it, and it was voted down 80-20. So when push comes to shove, I think most people look around their community, look what gets done by the Community Preservation Act, and say, yeah, that's for us. So the money that the community raises gets matched by the state, and the state's match comes from real estate transactions, but real estate transactions have been a little soft recently, so the state match was getting down to about 20%. Not good enough. So we wanted to take some money out of the surplus and put it into the state match to bring the match up to closer to 50%.
State revenues have been down, though.
State revenues were down in
March.
In March, and and April. The first 15 days of May looked as though it picked up a little. So we'll have to see.
Is that something that's, as you look at it? I mean, obviously, 1 or 2 months doesn't make a trend, but it's got to be alarming because the state has had the cash and put them in reserves, and now if you're taking from that, stabilization,
Yeah.
you could be in trouble too.
Yeah, well, we're a long way off from needing that stabilization.
Right.
Because although revenues didn't come, tax collection didn't come in as expected, we were planning on a lower, we set the budget based on a lower estimate of tax receipts. So we've still got we've got leeway.
Yeah.
And the budget that's being set for next year, which has just been debated and passed by the House and then last week by the Senate, that is very conservative. So let's hope it's conservative enough.
Right.
We'll see. But meanwhile, as you point out, because of those 2 great years we had in 2022 and 2023,
And unexpected as well.
completely unexpected.
Right.
Great years for the state, a lot of federal money coming in. We really increased our rainy day fund,
Right.
and that's now up to about $8 billion. And when I came in, sort of in the midst of the '08 Great Recession, we were down to about 500 million. So we've built it up, and it's there for a rainy day, which will come.
Yeah.
We'll know it. The economy goes up and down. It's good to have something. I'm sure you have a rainy day fund. I try to have. Everybody tries to have a rainy day fund. City does. State wants to. So we've got a nice fund. Hopefully we don't have to dip into it next year.
2 things that I know we've talked about in the past that weren't in the Senate budget that are in the House budget. I know one is the online gambling for the lottery.
Yes.
The Senate didn't have that. I know obviously you got to work in the conference committee as we talk about revenues. I don't know if that, I didn't see a reason why it's not in there. I haven't read that yet, but I was just curious that hadn't happened. And now it's got to work, and you don't know what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, Jim, I agree. I haven't heard officially what the Senate opposition to that is. Haven't heard. I know some people are afraid it'll cut into the lottery, which we're so dependent on.
Right, in stores, the convenience store lotteries,
Right,
yes.
the retail sales of lottery tickets. So we'll see about that. The other thing that something that the Senate had, which the House didn't have, is the Senate President's idea of providing free community college for folks who are over 25 who haven't completed junior college yet, and community college. We're still very short on workers. We need to be constantly retraining people as jobs shift. So I think that notion of trying to encourage more people to come back into community college, get that certificate to be a nurse's assistant, get that certificate to go into cyber protection or wherever the jobs are emerging. I think that's a very valid thought, and let's see if we can do that within the combined budget.
But that's going to cost money too, to provide that. And again, there are those that say, playing devil's advocate, well, if so-and-so isn't going to college, why should I be paying? Or if I didn't, why? Sure. What's in it for me?
Sure. And I guess that the folks who propose that say that a trained workforce is important to us all. And we're short trained workers right now. That means that there's less business at the corner convenience store because there's less money in the pockets of folks who live around here. And getting a trained workforce is very important to New Bedford, South Coast.
Right.
Yeah.
I know also, as you talked about college and tuition, one issue up is the undocumented immigrants and getting at least in-state tuition.
Yes.
And that's obviously an issue that's still looking to be settled up there, and I would imagine that that's not an easy one. Obviously, when you look at New Bedford, it's a huge issue, but then there are those communities that don't see the impact of that.
Yeah, and I think that comes under the category also of training workers. And we all know that because Washington has not had an official immigration policy the way we used to, which provided for a yearly flow of workers coming into the country, which we needed and need. Because we haven't had that, there's the number of people who are here without documentation. They're in the workforce. Mm-hmm. Do we train them? That's going to be the debate.
The other thing that's not in the Senate budget that I know that you spoke about passionately the last time you were here too is that the Senate bill doesn't include the free meals in schools for students. The Senate appears to want to take it up separately down the road, but it's not in the budget. And I know that you were talking about the last time you were here, we had to continue that, but you also, being the farmer, you were looking at fresh food for these kids, because for a lot of kids, they don't get any other meal during the day. So I don't know if that's something to look at. Is that something that the House, do you think, looks at because we should take care of it in the budget, or do you wait for the Senate to take it up in some sort of other piece of legislation? Because certainly, there's a lot of kids, and obviously in your district, that rely on that meal or lunch, and then they get some sort of breakfast too.
Breakfast and lunch, yeah. I don't know, Jim. To me, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, it's for every student. I don't know if they, and it doesn't say, but I don't know if they want to go back to not every student, and if
Yeah, and so a student will have to have a particular card,
correct,
which maybe brands them amongst their peers as disadvantaged. And we all know students are at an age where peer pressure is very important. What does that do to you if you come in looking like a kid whose parents couldn't support them? And I think in New Bedford, the vast majority of kids qualify for the free lunch and breakfast. So for all of us coming from urban districts, be it New Bedford, Fall River, Springfield, Worcester, it seemed like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Of course you do this.
Do you feel on issues like this that when you're dealing with the urban issues versus the suburban issues, is it a hard sell to try to get pieces of legislation passed because there are those that don't see it or don't have to deal with it on a daily basis in their communities? I mean, maybe they do, but not at the extent that you have to.
Yeah, sure. Well, Jim, you always have to reach out to the folks who represent different communities. And I've always felt that it was hard to get rural community initiatives passed because Massachusetts is basically a state of urban communities. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where the population is. You take Boston right there, and then you add Worcester and Springfield and so on, New Bedford, Fall River, you get in my mind, a very healthy majority. And when we're talking about things for the Acushnets, Freetowns, and Westports of this world, we have to reach out to our colleagues in the urban areas and explain why it's important to New Bedford, for instance, to support, let's take a subject that's really important to me, to support agriculture. Mm-hmm. Okay, why is agriculture important to New Bedford? And we've had a lot of conversations on that topic, and I have to say, I get a lot of support from my colleagues because they understand that having a source of local healthy food that can come into the schools, which New Bedford does a great job on buying local for the kids' meals, or that can be in the local grocery stores, is very important to New Bedford as an urban whole. So, but you got to make that case.
Right. And the interesting thing too, especially in this area, this district area, I mean, the good thing is, for example, you represent New Bedford, but you represent Westport and Freetown. So, I mean, you've got...
And Acushnet.
So you've got the two things. Representative Strauss has Acushnet as well as Fairhaven and
And part of New Bedford.
Yeah, Chris Hendricks previously had a Acushnet, so he knows the. So I mean, you've got people who know. It's got to be the selling of the other folks that, because you pretty much have everybody has a piece of both communities.
Yeah, Chris Markey,
Dartmouth.
primarily Dartmouth, but a piece of New Bedford.
Right. So it's they understand the value of both cases and what happens. I don't know if that's like that everywhere though. So, but it's interesting too. Housing. I know we talk a lot about housing, and I know obviously you're just looking at the Senate, but based on the House budget and what you hope in the Senate, anything in the budget do you think will be implemented by July 1st to help just with the housing issues this state is facing? And it's not just New Bedford, it's the state.
Yeah, sure, it's the state. And it's probably, I would say, Jim, it's probably the biggest issue that the state faces.
And all your colleagues have said the same thing. This is the issue right now.
I mean, there's a big debate going on right now. We passed the so-called millionaires tax, which adds 4% on incomes over $1 million. And there's a concern that that is going to drive out of the state folks who are doing well, and when they leave the state, because after all, you can work these days. You can work anywhere, in many jobs.
Yeah,
right?
the Globe was just reporting on this story, how people are leaving for New Hampshire and Florida, and because the taxes are too high.
Yeah,
and the millionaires tax affected that.
Yeah, and we really need to pay close attention to those statistics to see. There are others who argue that we are losing people because we can't house them. And the folks who we really want to attract are younger people, well educated, and it's just real hard to find housing. Used to be just Boston, but it's getting hard to find housing here in New Bedford.
How is it in the smaller communities that you represent too? Housing has got to be an issue in Westport or Freetown or Acushnet, because I know some people say, well, the suburbs have to pick up some of the slack. And I think it's not just a question of affordable housing. I think there's just not enough physical housing around.
Very true, Jim.
So how does that play out from where you sit, that you've got a city that's desperate for housing, and again, I don't know if people understand what the smaller communities are facing.
Yeah. So I hear that as much in Westport as I do.
Do you really?
Yeah, in New Bedford.
Yeah.
The fire chief says to me, I was lucky. I was able to buy a house 25 years ago. I'm concerned that my kids won't be able to live in Westport. Yeah.
So there's not just price, but physically there's not a lot of housing available in these smaller towns.
And we know in Westport we need housing generally, but we also specifically need affordable housing. We need senior housing. I can't tell you how many older people come up to me. They've been living in Westport all their life, have a beautiful ranch home. Spouse dies, harder to keep the property up. They want to stay in Westport, but there's no housing available. We have 40 units at Greenwood Terrace, and we just built 60 units at Nokichoke down by the former Lincoln Park 5 years ago. We could use double, triple that number. An issue for the Westports and Freetowns and Acushnets of this world is that we don't have the infrastructure.
Right.
We don't have water. We don't have public water. We don't have public sewer. So.
And people worry about schools and the municipal services that are provided because they don't have the staffing with the more people that come in too.
Yes, although with senior housing and much veteran housing, you don't necessarily have the impact on the schools.
Right. True. Yep.
So that to me is a no-brainer. But we need the housing, but it's a little harder to build it in the Westports of this world.
So where do you see this? And again, your colleagues have touched on this in detail when they've done the show the past few months. As you look at the budget, where do you see in the next few months the legislature sort of going in this? Because obviously you've got a unique perspective from where you sit. How do we address this?
Well, both the House budget and the Senate budget have money to help provide more, particularly affordable housing. And I think that with the governor having created a secretary for housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first time it's ever been done.
She split that up out of economic development.
Yep.
And I think that's terrific that she's done that. And I think that working with communities to make it easier to get permitted to build housing is going to be an important part of creating that housing.
Do you find that your colleagues, both in the House and Senate that you've talked to, that this is something that they know they can't talk about? They have to, something has to be addressed right now.
I think it's gotten to that level.
Yep. That's good. You and I were talking beforehand off camera about the report in the newspaper today about the, I guess, the work that's being done on Beacon Hill so far in this new legislative session, and that since January only 10 pieces of legislation have been passed into law, and questioning what's getting done on Beacon Hill right now. Just want to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about that, because there are those that say, and obviously you're a Democrat, there are those that say that the one-party system is hurting debate and legislation getting done.
Yeah, so the Democrats do have a strong presence in both the House and the Senate. But you know, Jim, a lot of bills that pass, they pass unanimously. So that tells me that the Democratic leadership are listening to their colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So that to me is an important indicator. As far as the Globe, which was kind of taking a pot shot and saying that much hadn't been done yet, I can just say that from my point of view, the committee that I chair, which is the Agricultural Committee,
yep.
And by the way, it's the first time that we have a standalone ag committee in the Commonwealth, if you can believe it or not. It's the first time we've had agriculture.
Well, it's just kind of the same thing that you and I were just talking about. Housing's never had its own secretary. Now you get your own secretary. You'd think that agriculture would have its own committee, but...
So it really allows housing to be focused with the secretary, and we hope that it really allows us as a Commonwealth to focus on agriculture, to be sure that we're getting local, healthy, raised foods into New Bedford, into the schools, into the local communities. We, as an agricultural community, as an agricultural committee, have already had 3 hearings. You know, every bill, and there's 7,000 bills that are filed every 2 years.
Right.
Every bill has to have a hearing, has to be public, has to allow for advocates and opposers to come in. And by the way, this year, we now allow people to testify remotely.
Right.
So you don't have to come into Boston, and God knows nobody likes going to Boston.
Yeah.
I love my job, Jim. I hate the,
Yeah.
but you don't have to go to Boston to give testimony. You can do it from your home on your computer. Ag Committee has had 3 hearings. We've heard all of our bills, and we're now planning a series of listening tours around the Commonwealth so that we can understand directly from the people who we want to represent, farmers, about which of the bills that we've heard are important to them.
How big is the agriculture industry in the state? I don't think people grasp how big it is.
Yeah, it's a $10 billion industry.
And it's all over the state.
Cranberries
Yep.
here in the southeast. Dairy, a lot of dairy farms still going on out in the western part of the state. And every community has a farmer's market these days,
Yeah.
it seems.
And they're in the cities, they're very popular. In New Bedford, I know there's multiple.
And by the way, let me just put in a pitch for folks who are on SNAP, who receive a SNAP benefit.
Yeah.
You can go to a farmer's market and through the HIP program, Healthy Incentives Program, HIP, you get an extra $40, $50 a month for using at the farmer's market. It's great because it gives folks who are short on money an opportunity to get more local raised foods, and it's great for the farmers because it allows more people to be able to buy local healthy food.
This is what you do. We got a couple minutes left, but I just want to, with inflation, how much has that impacted farmers? Cost of goods and services are up. How does that impact you?
Diesel fuel,
Yep.
$3 to $6. Yeah.
But do you have to, is it a balancing act, keeping the food affordable for people who need it? I mean, so then, in a sense, your profit margin has got to be smaller.
Jim, I hear that all over the Commonwealth.
Yep.
Farmers saying, my fuel is up, my labor is up.
Yep.
If you can get people to work, they want more, obviously. I can't put the price of my carrots up that much. I know my customers.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how do you do that though? From your standpoint, where you're sitting, how are you battling that? Are you making anything to stay in business?
You got to eat.
That's true. Eggs have gone up, for crying out loud.
Unbelievable. Although they've backed off now. Yeah.
Oh, that was because of the fowl, the swine, not the swine flu, the fowl,
the K,
flu,
there.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it did go up. They had a huge jump.
Yeah. Got an issue coming in pork also, where all pork sold in Massachusetts may have to be produced under the different method, more humane.
Okay.
I don't know if it is or isn't, but under more humane methods, which not much pork is raised these days. So if all pork sold in Massachusetts has to come from the more humane farmers, then the scarcity prices will go up. So right now, I would say to your listeners, if you see pork at the Stop and Shop, at the grocery store on sale, I would say buy it.
All right, that's going to do it. Lots to talk about. Let us know about the tour so we can promote those as well. You're listening to in the area, we can certainly get that out there. So it's great seeing you again. A busy couple of months coming up, that's for sure.
Thank you, Jim. Well, it's all good, and all of us who are so honored to hold an elected position really appreciate the opportunity to serve, and we appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you and let people know what we're going on, because you don't get that information out of the newspapers anymore.
Yeah. Thanks. We'll talk to you in a couple of months, I know, when your turn's up again. Good seeing you.
Always.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Beacon Hill Report. Got my shows messed up. That's going to do it for this edition of the Beacon Hill Report. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again.